Hello, hello, hello. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. What that means is that I'm generally speaking the guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion. You have questions about them all. You can ask me any sort of question. And I'm the guy that not only will be able to answer it, but if necessary, do a whole bunch of research and then get back to you and answer it. So that being said, we have another video for you with 10 questions that I've chosen from the previous week of questions. And if you want to ask me a question, you can feel free to do so right in the comments section. Leave me I love getting comments, even if they're not questions, and I highly suggest that, for engagement purposes and to help push us in the algorithm and help the channel grow, that you like the video, that you subscribe if you haven't, and if you're thinking, well, maybe, I don't know, wait till the end of the video. I'll ask again. I'll remind you again about subscribing. And leave me a comment, even if it's just to say hi or just to tell me that you like the video or what your favorite part was, or to answer any of the hypothetical questions that I may ask in the coming hour or so. That being said, if you want to ask a question that will be answered in a video, there's currently two ways you can do that. The first way is the traditional way through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question, have people with relevant knowledge or expertise or experience answer the question. And if you ask any sort of Tolkien question on there, there are a lot of people on there who have a lot of knowledge on Tolkien, and you'll get a list of them when you ask the question and submit it. And of course, my name will be on that list, probably near the top, possibly at the top. I don't know, but I haven't looked at that in a long time. But I'll be there, and there is a link directly to my Quora account in the description of this video in case you just want to go that route and just do it easily. And there is also a space that I maintain on Quora called the Grey Havens, where you can find all of my writing, as well as the writing of many others that I respect on Quora. But if you don't want to deal with Quora, maybe you don't have an account or you don't feel like making an account, even though it's really easy, I've made a way where you can submit questions on YouTube other than the comment section, separate from it, that are specifically made to be answered in a video. And keep in mind, I won't answer you through this. I will answer you in a video. So what you want to do is you can go to the community tab, or the posts tab, as it is usually called, and you could make a post there. I've opened that up where anybody can make a post. I found that it tends to only work on the mobile version of YouTube, which I think is not the greatest thing. I think a lot of you guys might be watching on a computer, or if you're wanting to type up a whole question, you might be on a computer. But either way, just load up the mobile app and do that. If there's a way to do it on a computer, please let me know, actually, because when I tried to do it, when I switched over to a different YouTube account just to sort of see if how it works, and I couldn't find it, but I was able to find it on the app very quickly. So that being said, I'd like to also do a reading for you. And as you can see here, I am in front of the fabled city of Gondolin, which famously fell in the First Age. And I have a book all about that here, which is The Fall of Gondolin. And this is a really interesting book because it basically contains every version of the tale of the Fall of Gondolin, from his first version that he wrote in, I believe it was 1917, the first couple of stories that he wrote when Tolkien was in a hospital after contracting trench fever during his military service in World War I. And he had quite the serious case of trench fever because he was laid up for a while. It's not a very serious condition. People very rarely die from it. But in his case, he was laid up for quite a while, and his wife, Edith, was there with him, and he wrote the first few stories, which were the primitive Fall of Gondolin, the very earliest poetic version of Beren and Luthien, and he started on the Children of Húrin, although I think that was maybe a little bit later. But anyway, I wanted to read the earliest version of the tale of the Fall of Gondolin, so you can get a view into Tolkien's very earliest writing. This is, of course, it's well before The Lord of the Rings. It's well before The Hobbit. Even The Hobbit was in the 30s. We're talking about 1917 here. So let's read a little bit. I'm just going to start from the beginning of this primitive Fall of Gondolin, which he, in his own notes, he would refer to it as Prim FG. And I'll read you a few pages here. Then said Little Heart, son of Bronwag, Know then that Tur was a man who dwelt in very ancient days in that land in the north called Dor Loman, in the land of shadows. And of the Eldar the Noldoli know it best. Now the folk whence Tur came wandered the forests and fells, and knew not and sang not of the sea. But Tur dwelt not with them, and lived alone about that lake called Mithrim, now hunting in its woods, now making music beside its shores on his rugged harp of wood and the sinews of bears. Now many, hearing the power of his rough songs, came from near and far to hearken to his harping. But Tur left his singing and departed to lonely places. Here he learnt many strange things and got knowledge of the wandering Noldoli, who taught him much of their speech and lore, but he was not fated to dwell forever in those woods. Thereafter it is said that magic and destiny led him on a day to a cavernous opening down which a hidden river flowed from Mithrim, and Tur entered that cavern seeking to learn its secret. But the waters of Mithrim drove him forward into the heart of the rock, and he might not win back into the light. And this, it is said, was the will of Ulmo, Lord of Waters, at whose prompting the Noldoli had made that hidden way. Then came the Noldoli to Tur and guided him along dark passages amid the mountains, until he came out into the light once more, and saw that the river flowed swiftly in a ravine of great depth with sides unscalable. Now Tur desired no more to return, but went ever forward, and the river led him always toward the west. The sun rose behind his back and set before his face, and where the water foamed among many boulders or fell over falls, there were at times rainbows woven across the ravine. But at evening its smooth sides would glow in the setting sun, and for these reasons Tur called it the Golden Cleft, or the Gully of the Rainbow Roof, which in the speech of the gnomes, Glorfalk or Chris Ilbranticloth. Now Tur journeyed here for 3 days, drinking the waters of the secret river and feeding on its fish, and these were of gold and blue and silver and of many wondrous shapes. At length the ravine widened, and ever as it opened its sides became lower and more rough, and the bed of the river more impeded with boulders against which the waters foamed and spouted. Long times would Tur sit and gazed at the splashing water and listen to its voice, and then he would rise and leap onward from stone to stone, singing as he went. Or as the stars came out in the narrow strip of heaven above the gully, he would raise echoes to answer the fierce twanging of his harp. One day, after a great journey of weary going, Tur at deep evening heard a cry, and he might not decide of what creature it came. Now, he said, it is a fey creature. Now, nay, 'tis but some small beast that waileth among the rocks. Or again, it seemed to him that an unknown bird piped with a voice new to his ears and strangely sad. And because he had not heard the voice of any bird in all his wandering down the golden cleft, he was glad of the sound, although it was mournful. On the next day of an hour of the morning, he heard the same cry above his head, and looking up beheld 3 great white birds, beating back up the gully on strong wind, and uttering cries like to the ones he had heard amid the dusk. Now these were the gulls, the birds of Ose. In this part of that riverway there were islets of rock amid the currents, and fallen rocks fringed with white sand at the gully side, so that it was ill going. And seeking a while, Tur found a spot where he might labour scale the cliffs at last. Then came a fresh wind against his face, and he said, This is very good, and like the drinking of wine. But he knew not that he was near the confines of the great sea. And he went along the waters. That ravine again drew together, and the walls towered up so that he fared on a high cliff top, and there came a narrow neck, and this was full of noise. Then Tur, looking downward, saw the greatest of marvels, for it seemed that a flood of angry water would come up to the narrows and flow back against the river to its source. But that water, which had come down from distant Mithrim, would still press on, and a wall of water rose nigh to the cliff top, and it was crowned with foam and twisted by the winds. Then the waters of Mithrim were overthrown, and the incoming flood swept roaring up the channel, and whelmed the rocky islets, and churned the white sand, so that Tur fled and was afraid. who did not know the ways of the sea, but the Ainur put it into his heart to climb from the gully when he did, or he had been whelmed in the coming tide, and that it was a fierce one by reason of a wind from the west. Then Tur found himself in a rugged country bare of trees, and swept by a wind coming from the set of the sun, and all the shrubs and bushes leaned to dawn, because of the prevalence of that wind. And here for a while he wandered, till he came to the black cliffs by the sea, and saw the ocean and its waves for the first time. And at that hour the sun sank beyond the rim of earth far out to sea, and he stood on the cliff top with outspread arms, and his heart was filled with a longing very great indeed. Now some say that he was the first of men to reach the sea, and look upon it, and know the desire it brings, but I know not if they say it well. So I think that's enough there. So here is some of Tolkien's very earliest writing in the Legendarium, and Tur is actually, I wouldn't say my favorite character in all of the Legendarium, but certainly I think my favorite character to talk about, because I think he's so interesting. And if this is in fact the first Legendarium writing that he wrote, it may have been this, it may have been Beren and Luthien, the Lay of Luthien, as it was called at that time. But I tend to think it might be this, or I prefer to think that it might be this. And the reason that I say that is because of my feeling about Tur as a character as being the most significant and most important character in the entire Legendarium. And when we look at it, the history of everything, starting from the Ainur Lindala, and then going right through to the end of the Third Age, and the fall of Sauron, and the beginning of the Fourth Age, and and the last of the elves, starting to pass over the sea and everything. Everything before Tur sort of flowed into him, that he's sort of the linchpin, that all the great houses of men, and there are several houses of the Edain, the noblemen of Middle-earth, and he has the blood of all of them. And then everything flowed out of him, not just men, but many of the elves, and of course the Fall of Gondolin, the War of Wrath, Earendil, his son. There's just so much going on that he's sort of directly or indirectly responsible for. I made a meme once, and I'll put it up if I find it, where it was sort of the dominoes, starting with a man follows some birds to the sea, or I forgot how I wrote it. Like I said, if I find it, it'll be up on the screen, and ending with Sauron is defeated. The Fourth Age starts. And this is really interesting because this really is the most significant narrative event in to happen in Beleriand and to happen in Middle-earth in the First Age, other than the awakening of the elves. Of course, that wasn't in Beleriand; it was far to the east in Cuiviénen. But Tolkien didn't write about that yet, and he did, he talked about the Noldali, and he mentions the gnomes. The gnomes would later be pretty much be called the Sindar at that point. Although some gnomes became Noldor, and you can see the sort of linguistic similarities there. But he was also using Noldoli early on, and and if you go over to Beren and Luthien, you can see that Tolkien was sort of a little bit all over the map at this point as to what these creatures were called as a whole. He calls Beren an elf, he calls Luthien a fairy, and then there are gnomes in that as well, and we kind of learned that these were all just like names for different types of elves. And he later he even mentioned Eldar in this one, and he later decided that there all the elves are the elves, the Eldar, and he dropped gnome, he dropped fairy. He came up with the four basic types of elf, which are not really, species, but really cultural divides. You have the Vanyar, you have the Teleri, you have the Noldor, and you have the Avari, and then all of the others that, come from that. The Sindar, for example, are types of Teleri. Most of them come from the Teleri because there were more Teleri elves than any others. But that being said, it's really interesting, especially the abrupt way that it starts. Then then said Little Heart's son of Bronweg, and here he's establishing sort of a narrator. This is who's telling the story. Some guy named Little Heart, who is the son of some guy named Bronweg. Do we know much about these characters? No, not really. But he's sort of saying that this is a story within a story. This is a story of a time long ago. And he had that idea of that he really just translated everything, and that it was brought to him by a guy named Elfwine, who brought a copy of the Red Book of Westmarch, from the Undying Lands to what had Middle-earth had become, which was where they would have landed would have been Western Europe, and Oxford is like the general area where the Shire would have been. So it's really sort of interesting to see sort of where he began and where he ended, especially considering that there's a lot of different versions of this, but the last version, and it's literally just called the final version in here, is what we would know as Of Turin is Coming to Gondolin, which is in Unfinished Tales. I believe it's the first story in Unfinished Tales. I'm just going to grab Unfinished Tales here. I think it's the first story before even the Children of Hurin. Yes, Of Turin is Coming to Gondolin, and then the Children of Hurin is the second part. And then there's all the Númenor stuff, So what's really interesting here is, he started off with this great detail of Tuor's journey, and that the Fall of Gondolin really is the tale of Tuor. That doesn't come through in the Silmarillion as much as it could, because the Silmarillion is just part of the tale, and he was wanting to, spin all of the great tales of the First Age into these more detailed versions, and he was actually working on the last version, when he died. And so it's really great contrast to read the first version and then the last version and see, obviously, how much the writing has changed. The writing is way, way better. I've always said that, my favorite, of Tolkien's stories is The Children of Hurin, but where I felt he did his best writing was that final unfinished version of The Fall of Gondolin, which you can find in Unfinished Tales, or just, in the book The Fall of Gondolin, where it's called the final version. And it's unfinished. It stops right when Tuor, finally gets through the seven gates and enters Gondolin. But it's some of his very best writing. But it's also interesting to see how much didn't change, and the stuff that didn't change from 1917 down to like in the early 70s when he was finishing it, or attempting to finish it when he died. And of course, he was working on so many different things when he died. It wasn't just the Fall of Gondolin. It was a lot of stuff about Galadriel as well. But, the elements that he kept the same, I think, are the elements that he thought had to have been the very most important things, and that it is a big focus on Tuor, and that it was his harp is really important. Although they don't talk about him having rough songs in the final version, he had beautiful, beautiful songs that he filled up the Valley of Lambeth with his own music that momentarily drowned out the forever echoing scream of Morgoth that only stopped once the First Age ended and the whole region fell into the sea. And the fact that it was the gulls, there were swans also, but there were swans and there were gulls. And I could talk about a lot of the numeric stuff about the number 3 and the number 7 and the significance of them throughout Tolkien's Legendarium, but let's not get too into that. I'll certainly talk more about that stuff in the future, but let's get to your questions. We have 10 questions to get through today, so let's start with the first one. Our first question here comes in by the request of the Oski Boski, who asks me, why couldn't Gondor destroy Mordor in the Second Age after the fall of Sauron? Probably because the Second Age was over at that point. The fall of Sauron heralded the end of the Second Age. Appendix B in The Lord of the Rings spells out that after Sauron's fall and the taking of the One Ring by Isildur, that the Third Age began. So there was no further Second Age in which to destroy Mordor. Now, you could point at me and say, John, stop being pedantic. Why didn't they destroy Mordor after that? Well, if you read the backstory, it's actually abundantly clear. Elendil, the High King, had died. And now the war is over, and the realm has to attempt to recover, and it really never did. At least not until the very end of the Third Age, when Aragorn became the new king. Isildur wished to set up a situation where he would replace his father, Elendil, as the High King, and then his son, Ilendur, would be the king of Arnor, and his nephew, Meneldiel, would be the king of Gondor. So it would be sort of a similar situation that he had with him and his brother Anarion, where they were both kings and they were below Elendil, who was the High King. However, when he was traveling to the north to establish the kingdom of Arnor and also to deliver the One Ring to Elrond and Rivendell, he just never got there. He died. He was killed along with Elendil and two of his other sons, Aratan and Cirion. So this left only one surviving son, Valandil. Valandil set himself up as the king of Arnor, but now there's no High King, and Elendil's realm has been fractured into two distinct countries that are independent of each other. Now, it should be mentioned at this point that Valandil is actually 13 years old, and his cousin Meneldiel is 125 years old. And keep in mind, in their culture, that of Númenor, you're not really considered to be a full adult until you're 25 years old. So Gondor was, finding itself a country that is now half of its previous size, with the northern realm ruled by a boy through, the assistance of Elrond. Now, keep in mind that the war against Sauron was 12 years long, and it was extremely costly to Gondor and to Arnor and to the elves as well. And now it's a time of peace. Isildur was not idle in those 2 years as High King before he died. He established Minas Ithil, which is a tower of guard over Mordor. And there were still orcs, and there were all matter of Sauron's remnants that were left in Mordor, and they had to be, kept an eye on, which was the point of Minas Ithil. But the war itself is over, which leaves Mordor again to, just sort of be left alone. If they invaded them to just try to fully eradicate, all the orcs and everything, this would only be, costly, not only in terms of, actual economics, but as well as the lives of the men of Gondor. Not to mention, it's kind of a bad look to just try to fully wipe out a race because they participated in a war against you. So the fact is that Gondor, at this point, they're ready for peace. It was a young country that had gone to war pretty much as soon as it was established. And as far as they knew, Sauron's gone forever. So as long as, whoever it was in Mordor left them alone, they weren't going to try to go in and wipe them out. So there was no need to have any further war against Mordor at that point in time. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question also comes in by the request of the Oski Boski, who asks me, how did Sauron control the Nine when he wasn't in possession of the One Ring? So this is one of those kind of confusing things, and it's a little complicated, but I'm going to try to make you understand as best I can. While the One Ring, was the implement that was used to dominate these 9 men who would become the Nazgûl, there was a point of no return for them, and there are other considerations to talk about. The Nazgûl are bound to their rings, which are bound to the One Ring, which is bound to Sauron. He is the Lord of the Rings. Not having the ring physically does prevent him from dominating people holding rings of power, and it prevents him from creating new ring wraiths. But it was said that Sauron holds the 9 as well. And this is slightly up in the air. I've talked about this in a previous episode. We don't really know if Sauron held the 9 rings or not. There's sort of a difference of opinion between Galadriel and Gandalf seemed to change his mind at one point. But regardless of that, holding those rings alone would give him full dominion over the Nazgûl if he had them, with the only caveat being that their allegiance could possibly change to a new Lord of the Rings if someone that was, sufficiently strong and had a very powerful will would to take the One Ring and master it, sort of like what Galadriel considered doing. Even without all of that, let's say, stop talking about the 9 rings for a second. The Nazgûl had worn their rings for so long that they became wraiths. They're undead, and Sauron's a necromancer. They lost their will fully. Nothing could give them their free will back except for, the sweet release of death when they finally would pass from the world. So in this world, they would never be able to act in a way that Sauron does not wish. Unless, of course, there was a new Lord of the Rings. But as Gandalf pointed out, and as Galadriel also explained to Frodo, they would not be good, the Lord of the Rings, because the power of the ring is wholly evil and cannot be used for good means. Tolkien talks a lot about this in Letter 131, and I might talk a little bit about Letter 131 again later, as well as a whole lot of extra stuff about how being merely physically separated from the ring doesn't actually diminish Sauron's abilities. I'm going to read you that relevant part here. But to achieve this, he had been obliged to let a great part of his own inherent power, a frequent and very significant motive in myth and fairy story, pass into the One Ring. While he wore it, his power on earth was actually enhanced, but even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was in rapport with himself. He was not diminished, unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron to become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. Now, notice that he uses the word heroic there because sometimes, it could be somebody like Galadriel who wishes to do good with the ring, but they would only wind up usurping Sauron, becoming like him. Even earlier than the Galadriel discussion, one of the very first part that Tolkien wrote for the Lord of the Rings was the chapter Shadow of the Past, and this is where Frodo offers the ring to Gandalf, and he says, "Don't tempt me. I would have a very good reason to use it. I would find a lot of things that I could do with it, and I would really try to do good, but it wouldn't work. I would just become like the Dark Lord himself." So it's a common misconception that losing the One Ring diminished Sauron, but, as I just read Tolkien's own words telling you otherwise, it was actually his defeat in combat that diminished him, and it was not very long after the Akalabeth happened, which also had diminished him. So he never really needed the ring to win. It wasn't the key to his victory. It was a possible road to his downfall, which we evidently saw in The Lord of the Rings. All right, let's move on to the next question. So our next question came in by the request of Shepherd of the Forest, and this one was actually requested on YouTube instead of on Quora. Of course, like I said earlier, you can ask me questions in comments, and I'll answer them in the comments, but you can use the community tab, which, like I said, I think it only works on mobile, but you can use the community tab to make posts there that I will consider questions being submitted for a video. So here is Shepherd of the Forest questions. Since Tolkien said that Era was indistinguishable from the God of Abraham, this necessitates the existence of the Trinity, which Tolkien as a Catholic was certain to believe had always existed and was the God of Abraham. This begs the question, did Manwë or any of the Ainur know about the second and third persons of the Triad, or did Eros simply choose to keep them concealed until the appointed time? I apologize for the lengthy question. Don't apologize for the lengthy question. Sometimes it takes some time to get the point across, and I think this is a good question. I'm not necessarily the exact right person to ask because I am a Tolkien scholar, but I am not a theologian. And I am not a student of Catholic doctrine. So I did do some research on this for you, and I think I came up with a rather good answer. But just to let you know that I'm not a theologian, this isn't my specialty. I actually might also kick this question over to Matt Richardson from the Council of Tolkien streams, because he's not a theologian, but he is Catholic and might have unique insight as well, so I might also ask for his input on this. But here's what I came up with. So I am aware, the concept of the Blessed Trinity, which is something that is not exactly exclusive to Catholic doctrine, but it's often focused on in their doctrine. So I went to an official source, which is a Catholic encyclopedia, which said the following, and I quote, "Thus, in the words of the Athanasian Creed, the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. And yet there are not three gods, but one God. In this trinity of persons, the Son is begotten of the Father by an eternal generation, and the Holy Spirit proceeds by an eternal procession from the Father and the Son. Yet, notwithstanding this difference as to origin, the persons are co-eternal and co-equal. All alike are uncreated and omnipotent. This, the Church teaches, is the revelation regarding God's nature, which Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came upon the earth to deliver to the world, and which he presupposes to man as the foundation of our whole dogmatic system." If you're wondering about the female pronouns there at the end, and I actually did happen to know this, that the church itself is often referred to by female pronouns, the Catholic Church at least. Now, the idea of God as a being and God as a spirit being one and the same is not really that hard to discern. Tolkien even touched upon this in the Ainulindala, with the flame imperishable, alternatively known as the secret fire, being a stand-in for the Holy Spirit, and Melkor making the mistake to think that they are separate. And I'm going to read a relevant section from the Silmarillion for you. "To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gift of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone to the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Ilúvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness, yet he found not the fire, for it was with Ilúvatar." Now, it becomes a little tricky when we talk about the whole concept of the Son, which is the part of the Trinity that would later become Christ. However, all of the stories of the Legendarium are pre-Christ, and thus he has not appeared in Ea or Arda as of yet, Ea being the created world, which we would commonly refer to as the universe, and Arda being what we would commonly refer to as the world or earth. Tolkien even went so far as to debunk any claims of beings such as Tom Bombadil, for example, being an aspect of Ilúvatar, stating that Ilúvatar will not walk upon Arda until he comes as Christ, which happens later. So that being said, we could just easily say that the Son didn't exist at this point, but my same Catholic encyclopedia sources goes on to discuss the following, and I'm going to read from that as well. "There is therefore nothing created, nothing subject to another in the Trinity, nor is there anything that has been added as though it once has not existed, but had entered afterwards. Therefore the Father has never been without the Son, nor the Son without the Spirit, and the same Trinity is immutable and unalterable forever." This obviously complicates our thoughts on this quite a lot. In this case, this is actually a nested source, and this is cited as being from a Declaration of Faith, which was written by a Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus, which is written sometime in the late 3rd century, which, as you might understand, is after Christ. So I could point out here that this is the opinion of a man. It's not the word of God, but that's a can of worms that, my non-theologian self is not willing to open. So what we may do is look at an older source definition of the Son, something older than that, going to the same source, the Catholic Encyclopedia that I found, so we get the following. "The title Son of God is frequent in the Old Testament. The word son was employed among Semites to signify not only filiation, but other close connection or intimate relationship. Thus, a son of strength was a hero, a warrior. A son of wickedness was a wicked man. Son of pride, wild beast. Son of possession, a possessor. Son of pledging, a hostage. Son of lightning, a swift bird. Son of death, one doomed to death. Son of a bow, an arrow. Son of Belial, a wicked man. Sons of prophets, disciples of prophets, etc. The title Son of God was applied in the Old Testament to persons having any special relationship with God. Angels, just and pious men, the descendants of Seth, were called sons of God." And there's some passages here that are cited. I'll give them to you. Job 1:6 and 2:1, Psalm 89:7, Wisdom 2:13, and a few others. So with this as an authority on the matter, we can surmise, and it is surmise, that saying Son of God and applying it to the Trinity would tell us that we could say in Tolkien's lexicon, it's children of Ilúvatar. But inclusive of them without being exclusive to them. The explanation tells us that the angels are also including anything in God as the Son. Kind of reminds me of the Joni Mitchell lyrics there. But I digress. The answer to the question then would be yes, in the way that the Ainur would be aware of the Trinity, in that they themselves are an aspect of the Son, but not the only aspect. We could, with maybe a little bit of cheek involved here, state that Tolkien's take on the Trinity in his Legendarium would go from the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit to the One, his creations, and the secret fire. That being said, I do think that it's incorrect to focus too much on this. The reason that I say this is because Tolkien said that Ilúvatar is the God of Abraham, but he's not writing a Catholic work. Now, he said The Lord of the Rings was a Catholic work in that it is something that he wrote, and then he looked at it, and he saw that it was very Catholic, and in revising it, he put in some extra Catholic themes, the most obvious of which being the lembas bread, being the Eucharist, but they were just Catholic themes. He wasn't trying to create something that was going to fit in with every single dogma of the Catholic Church, because that would be impossible. You can't really write a fantasy story that's going to fit in with every aspect of the Catholic Church and still be something that people actually want to read, general audiences. Not just, bishops and such. If you want to write something that bishops and cardinals are going to enjoy, then you could write that. But if you want to write something that people are going to enjoy, and that his children are going to enjoy, and that his wife is going to enjoy, and his friends are going to enjoy, then you have to work outside that. I'm going back to, I mentioned this earlier, letter 131, which was written to a man named Peter Hastings. He never actually sent the letter. He just wrote it, and then he decided that he felt that he came off a little too self-important, so he decided not to send it. I also think that he might have given away a little bit too much lore and stuff that was meant to remain a mystery, because he was desperately trying to explain himself. Peter Hastings was an owner of a Catholic bookstore, and he basically said to Tolkien, "Your theology is bad." And Tolkien basically was like, hey, so what? It's not meant to be theology. It's meant to be literature. And it might be self-important to say that it's meant to be didactic, meaning to teach a lesson or to give us something that we can apply to our lives in one way or another. But that's how he felt, So he wasn't meaning to write something that's completely going to follow every bit of Catholic dogma, especially since there has been a lot of Catholic dogma that doesn't follow Catholic dogma. There's Apocrypha, there's heresies within the church, there are things that wind up getting stricken from the record. They update things, I think I read something where just very kind of recently, like within the past few decades or so, they said there is no such place as limbo any longer, that they decided that that's not really a thing. So to think about, the Catholic Church as being something that existed for 2 millennia and had this as their dogma, that there is a place called limbo, and then to say, no, there isn't, things are subject to change, so you can't always satisfy everything. He was meaning to create a mythology, and the mythology being something that he feels fits in with reality as he sees it, not necessarily reality as the Pope sees it or reality as a cardinal sees it. And though he was a Catholic, I think it's incorrect to use words to apply to Tolkien like dogmatic or devout or whatever. He was a man of faith. He was deeply religious, but he didn't agree with every single thing in the Catholic religion. He had his own opinions about things. For example, he found that most priests to be rather unpleasant. He hated the whole idea of confession. But these are very important aspects of a Catholic Church, having priests and giving confession or some of the foundational ways that people are Catholic. So, like I said, I think you go down an interesting road, but not the best road when you try to say, well, how does everything that Tolkien wrote in the Legendarium apply to Catholic dogma, and how do we reconcile it? We don't really need to. I think I did a pretty good job of answering the question of the Trinity, and like I said, I might also kick that question over to Matt Richardson, because I think that he would have some interesting things to say, and probably some very correct things to say as well. But that's the best I could do. So let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Andrew Linus. I hope I'm saying it correctly. I might not be. If you happen to see this and I'm not saying it correctly, let me know. Why did the men of... let's try this again. Why the men of the West did not cross the Lune River and settle in the area of Lindon during the Fourth Age? As of Fourth Age 171, few Noldor elves dwell there, if any at all. Okay, so there's really 2 points here in that the premise might be untrue. I'm not saying that it is untrue. I'm saying it might be untrue. And the other is that if it is true, it's kind of a flawed premise. So let's examine the question as to why the men of the West, referring most likely to the Dunedain of Arnor and Gondor, did not move to the west to Lindon in the Fourth Age. So we can sort of attack this from 2 different angles. The first angle we can take on is, well, who said they didn't? Records of the Fourth Age are spotty at best, and we don't hear much beyond what pertains to members of the Fellowship of the Ring. Once they're either all dead or they've passed into the West, we don't really know much. There are bits found in Tolkien's draft of the aborted book The New Shadow, which is found in the Peoples of Middle-earth, that gives us a minuscule window into a slightly later period, but this commentary is focused only on Gondor and doesn't speak about such matters. So nobody ever said that, men did not move into Lindon. They may have, or they may not have. Going from the second angle, well, let's just assume that the premise is true, and it might be, that none of the Dunedain moved into that area in the Fourth Age or later. And the question then poses, well, why not? And the answer then would be purely conjecture, but that would likely come down to something as simple as they didn't want to. There's a lot of room in Middle-earth, and the area of Arnor and the greater area of Eriador was actually pretty underpopulated in the Third Age, so it's not like the land near the sea was needed in the Fourth Age. The population was going to go up, but it wasn't going to boom so crazily that they were going to really need that land. Aside from this, this would basically surround the Shire with the big people, something that they wouldn't want and something that Aragorn was not a fan of. Aragorn made the Shire bigger. He banned big people from going there, something that he himself abides by. So moving men into Lindon would be a bit of a territorial issue for the Shire hobbits. They would have men to the west, they would have men to the east, they would have men to the south. Okay, there's dwarves in the north, but still, unless, of course, at some point after Aragorn's death, they change those laws, I don't think that it would, it would happen. And even if it did, I think well, why specifically Lindon? There's so many other places that are sort of very empty that they could live in. So there's that as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, our next question comes in by the request of, oh no, I had this. Okay, so this is one of those where one person wrote the question and then another person asked me to answer it. So I think what I should do is I should probably just credit the person that specifically asked me to answer this. If I could find it, of course. I think it's in here. Okay. Oh, here it is. Yes. Okay, so this was requested by Clarissa DeFay. And Clarissa asked me, is the video game The Lord of the Rings, The War in the North considered to be canon? So the best thing that you can do for yourself is to divorce yourself from the concept of canon. Just try to do your best to erase this word from your lexicon. I've used the word myself, and I've been trying to just stop saying it. Stop saying canon. Stop worrying about canon. And I suppose in some cases the term canon can be seen as being, meaning official. But in this case, of course, it's official. It was a licensed game. However, what the question likely means is, does it have any bearing on the books, or is the lore supported by the books? Any and all adaptations are separate entities from the source material. The idea of canon is I think it's dubious at best. It's based on the idea that it is officially recognized as being written by the author. Tolkien did not write The War in the North. It is loosely based on things that he did write. So when people ask if something is canon, my reply is usually canon to what? In the case of The War in the North, we might say that it's canon to the films because it uses the likenesses and voices of some of the actors that were associated with the Peter Jackson films. But even then, the word canon is not really apt. Canon would suggest that it was written by the same people as the film. As best as I can discern, because I looked up the credits, the game's story was probably devised by a certain person named Scott Crawford, and he's not one of the 4 people who wrote the screenplay for The Lord of the Rings, and he's not J.R.R. Tolkien. So it's best to just fully yeet the idea of canon, just toss it away. Tolkien intended his books to be 2 things, literature and mythology. As literature, they stand on their own. Any materials based on them must also stand on their own. The films are not the books. The TV show is not the books, nor is it the movies. The video games are none of the above. They're all their own thing. All of the above include characters that were created by the producers of these works. For example, Peter Jackson created characters like Figwit or Toriel. The TV show has original characters like Arondir, and the video game, this specific video game, has a new villain named Angandor, who's a figure who's somewhat akin to the mouth of Sauron, but less of an emissary and more of a warrior. From a literary sense, none of these characters were created by Tolkien, and they don't appear and they're not alluded to in any of his works, all of which were created long after he died. As mythology, though, there's no such thing as canon. Think of it as the matter of Britain, which is often called the Arthurian legends. There is no one single author of the Arthurian legends, and many of the stories might contradict other stories. Anyone could write stories about characters like Merlin or Lancelot or Tristan, but there's no canon. There are classics. There are just the works that we agree are very good. So looking at it this way, I think is a good attitude to tackle what in the modern world we would refer to as fan fiction, something that Tolkien refers to as sub-creation. Now, before anybody gets their keyboard all warmed up to say Tolkien would never approve of blah, 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 blah. Yes, he did. He may not approve of specific stories that may have been written, or they might have been produced in a way that he may disagree with, but he absolutely approved of people filling in the gaps in his work, and some of these gaps were quite intentional. And I'm coming back for the 3rd time in this video to letter 131, really one of his best letters, and it's a shame he never sent it, but here it is. I'm going to read you part of letter 131. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the lard and cosmogonic to the level of romantic, fairy story, the larger founded in the lesser, in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It would possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Now, the vast majority of sub-creation, which includes adaptations, based on Tolkien's work, were created after his death. But there were ones that were proposed during his life, that even solicited his opinion and his approval. He was generally very gentle at first, and then he would become sort of increasingly annoyed as the work would deviate from his own. He explained to his son Christopher and his daughter-in-law Faith the idea of art or cash. If they want his approval, either get it exactly right or pay him enough to not care, which is, cash. He would express annoyance at things in these proposed adaptations throughout the 60s, such as Durin's Bane laughing, or Goldberry's depiction, or the suggestion that Old Man Willow was a servant of Sauron. And if those were produced in that state, he certainly would have voiced his opinion on them, but that doesn't mean that he would refer to them as sort of like a form of apocrypha, but rather that he just didn't agree with what they did with their subcreation. It's sort of like the typical free speech discussion that, you could defend somebody's right to subcreate based on your work while still disagreeing with the way that they go about it. So, I don't think that Tolkien would ever really concern himself too much with canon, so to speak, except for, what he wrote himself. And even then, he wrote some stories that are pretty wild and, don't exactly fit in with the others, and we have to sort of find ways for them to fit in with the others afterwards. So there is that as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question came in by the request of the Time Lord Victorious, who submitted this one via the YouTube community tab. Did the werewolves in The Lord of the Rings evolve into the wargs in the Third Age at some point? And I actually deleted one of Time Lord's posts because he posted twice two different variations of really the same question, and I looked at it, they were worded slightly different, but then I thought to myself, well, I think I can, encompass this into one thing. It seems, according to Gandalf, that wargs and werewolves are actually two distinct things. Gandalf sometimes has a flair for language, and he's dramatic, and he would break down things that didn't need to be broken down into categories, such as talking about orcs, goblins, and hobgoblins, which is, just a way of saying orc, big orc. This is actually explained in the foreword to The Hobbit and most of the modern editions. In the case of wargs and werewolves, we could go to a quote from Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, which I'm going to read for you now. Because these horses are born and bred to the service of the Dark Lord in Mordor, not all his servants and chattels are wraiths. There are orcs and trolls, there are wargs and werewolves, and there have been and still are many men, warriors and kings that walk alive under the sun, and yet are under his sway, and their number is growing daily. So I would say that this is actually very different from what he said in the Hobbit about, like orcs and goblins and hobgoblins. There's no indication that Gandalf is being dramatic here. He simply states orcs. He doesn't go into different varieties or different words for orc, nor does he do this with trolls. And with men, he only mentions that there are both warriors and kings in Sauron's employ. He is also speaking very calmly to Frodo, explaining that there are just, many different types of beings that have aligned themselves with Sauron. In The Hobbit, it was different. He was stressing to Thorin the necessity to go through Mirkwood rather than skirt around it. Aside from being too long of a journey, there were great dangers. In other words, Gandalf had a very good reason to be dramatic about the dangers, but in this case, Frodo's lying in bed, he's recuperating from a traumatic experience, and he's asking very simple questions that have very easy answers, so there's no need for Gandalf to go all theatrical. So the reason that I established all that, and I talked about all that, is to lay the foundation for why I'm taking Gandalf at his word here, that warg and werewolf are two separate things. And this actually answers part of the question there. Werewolves actually still exist in the Third Age. It's just that they perhaps are not as prevalent as they were in the First Age. It is possible that Sauron, like Morgoth, kept werewolves in his court at Barad-dûr, where the wargs are wild wolves that roam throughout Middle-earth of their own free will. We do see this, I should say, as early as in The Hobbit, as the wargs, who are often referred to also as wild wolves, are counted as a separate force from the goblins, the orcs, in the Battle of Five Armies. And even earlier in the story, from that, the goblins and the wargs were said to often work together in raids, but they were separate cultures. So, what are the wargs exactly? They are intelligent beings. They speak their own language. Werewolves are similarly unexplained in the text. We know that it was likely Sauron himself that created them in the first age. The first werewolf was named Dragluin. The greatest werewolf was named Cacharoth, and Sauron himself could become a werewolf at will. In his letters, Tolkien spoke a little bit about the origin of the term warg, but his only reference to their origin would be that they were demonic. It's a word that he uses in letter 297, and it was later revealed in letter 290a. So calling them demonic at that period in time that the letters were written, 1966 for letter 290a and 1967 for letter 297, it suggests that they were the creations of necromancy. But whether they were created by Sauron or Morgoth or somebody else, or what their relation is to the werewolves, if they have a relation to the werewolves, it's unclear. The nomenclature werewolf suggests the spirit that inhabits it being mannish in origin, or at the very least derived of a child of Ilúvatar, while Tolkien's demonic description of wargs from his letters suggests that they are the progeny of possibly fallen Maiar, or perhaps evil spirits that came out of the discord of Melkor, or came up out of the earth. The former thought puts them as, say, evil counterparts to, like, the birds of heaven, while the latter puts them into a category that is more aligned with Shelob and her spawn in Mirkwood. And I prefer that version because they're extant to Middle-earth, and they seem to align themselves with Sauron by choice. I would say that this latter thought, that they are similar in origin to Shelob and her brood, has more of the ring of truth to it, where the werewolves were almost certainly created specifically by Sauron. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next request for a question comes in from J. Owens, who asks, why were the wise, like Gandalf and Elrond, so sure that destroying the ring would so wholly reduce the power of Sauron when Sauron himself thought that the ring had been destroyed and so thought himself capable of rising to power again without it? Well, obviously there's a difference of opinion here, and it's also a matter of tense. It's true that Sauron once thought that his ring had been destroyed by the elves, as it should have been done. This is something that Gandalf very clearly said, and it was past tense. Present tense, he knows that it was not destroyed, and he has come to understand a great number of things. Keep in mind that the One Ring is a unique artifact that was unlike anything that had ever been created before, and not even Sauron, who created it, fully understood it, because he never at any point considered the effect it would have when it was held by others, because he never planned for anyone else to hold it other than him. Tolkien wrote in his letters that Sauron was always in rapport with the power of the ring. I actually read that passage a little while ago, meaning that he was not weakened by it being separated from him. It was his power and his power only, unless something as strong or stronger than him manages to dominate it. Sauron was, however, extremely weakened by the 1-2 punch of the Akallabeth, followed by the defeat in the wars against the men and elves in Middle-earth and his personal combat with Elendil and Iranian Gil-galad. The destruction of 2 of his fanar, that's his physical bodies, within a relatively short period of time that really messed him up. So in this state, he's heavily weakened. It is not unreasonable for him to think that his ring may have been destroyed. Of course, here's the sticking point that I think a lot of people get stuck on. We, as readers, know what will happen to Sauron if his ring is destroyed, because we read The Lord of the Rings and we know, we read for ourselves what happened. However, I must again tap the sign, reader knowledge is not character knowledge. I'm wary of the question, how can Sauron think the ring was destroyed when he was still able to make a physical form and do things? It happens. This is not that question. I'm not saying I'm weary of this question, but that's another question that I get all the time, and I'm just like, oh, it's almost like the eagle question. It's like this again. Sauron has no idea what may become of him if his ring is destroyed. And even the wise they're only guessing. It's an educated guess, but it's still a guess. They certainly meant to deprive him of such a powerful tool and make sure that it never falls into the hands of any powerful being that might be able to master it, such as Saruman. So there were certainly differences of opinion about what happens to the power. And we actually see this with the three rings, two of which were in the room, when the Council of Elrond happened. One was on the hand of Elrond and another was on the hand of Gandalf. They weren't sure what would happen to their rings if the wand was destroyed. Elrond himself stated that some believe they would be released and purified and able to be wielded with no danger, while others believe that their powers would actually be gone. Elrond was of the latter, as was Galadriel, who had the third ring. They had their thoughts on what would happen, but they weren't sure. Elrond and Galadriel turned out to be correct, and Gandalf turned out to be correct that the destruction of the one would make Sauron so weak that he could never trouble the world again. But they weren't sure. They were operating on their own wisdom and most importantly, on faith. So you have to think, well, if they're not 100% sure, why go through the whole quest? Why send Frodo? Why do all this? And that's actually covered. It's because they don't want the ring falling into the wrong hands. They wouldn't even give it to Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is probably the one really powerful being in all of Middle-earth that is not going to become a Dark Lord. He doesn't really care about the ring. And they said, yeah, but he might just toss it in the lake, or he might give it to somebody, forgetting how important it is. He's not going to see the significance of it. We really just, even if it didn't work, they wanted to make sure that not only does Sauron never get to use that thing again, but nobody gets to use it again. So there's sort of this alternate motivation here that we have to really consider. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of somebody whose name is sort of a lewd pun. I think it's funny, but I'm not going to say it on YouTube. But the question is, did Mandos get his power of prophecy from Eru? Yes, all of the powers of all of the angels, the Ainur, came from Eru. There is no power within the world that does not have its origin in Eru Ilúvatar, and this lesson may be the precise reason being taught with creation. All power are gifts of Ilúvatar, the good and the ill, the fair and the foul, and to make the likes of Melkor understand this may be the exact reason why Ilúvatar made the music of the Ainur real. In the Silmarillion, Ilúvatar speaks this exact sentiment right after the Ainur and we can understand that he is mostly speaking to Melkor, but he's really speaking to all of the angels. The ones who sang with Melkor, the ones who sang with him, they all needed to hear this. And I'm going to read you this quote here. "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Ilúvatar. Those things that ye have sung I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done, and thou, Melkor, shall see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." So not only is all power, and music is both literal power and a metaphor for power, as it was music that created the universe, it's only there by the grace of Ilúvatar, but if the Ainur attempt to use it against him or for a will that is not his, they will find themselves unsuccessful. It is all his power, and it all serves his will in ways that they might not even understand. And for what it's worth, I think Namo, who is usually referred to as Mandos, he may have understood better than most of them, at the least that he knew that all evil turns to good does not excuse evil. It doesn't make evil okay. He was very clear about that in the Silmarillion. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the same person as the last question, the same sort of lewd pun, sort of this a name that you would give to like a substitute teacher, you know. Like I said, I think it's very funny, but I don't want to say it on YouTube. Here's the question anyway. Why did Sauron have the people of Númenor attack the Valar? Was it just to destroy them or to harm the Valar in a small way? So before we just dive in, it's not Valor, it's Valar. Valor is bravery. Valar is the Elvish word that means the powers, the mighty angels who reside in the Undying Lands. Valar, Valar. So Sauron's goal was always the complete and total destruction of Númenor and its culture. He ultimately failed, but it was a great victory for him. Sauron was under no delusions that Ar-Pharazôn had any shot at causing any real harm to the Undying Lands, and it didn't even come to violence. Just the simple act of Pharazôn walking on forbidden soil and declaring it to be his own was enough to cause a Calabeth, the downfall of Númenor. Even Pharazôn became doubtful and fearful as his flagship circumnavigated Tol-Eressëa, and he caught sight of Taniquetil, the highest peak in all of Arda that he knew Manwë and Varda resided on. He was filled with fear and apprehension and considered just turning around at that point, though his pride won over. It's always been my estimation that if at the shore stood Eanwe, standing silently and pointing in the direction of Númenor, they probably would have just turned around and left. But the issue is, it had already gotten too far. The downfall of Númenor happened before the Akalabeth, their loss of faith, their spurning of the elves, their pride, and with that, their belief that they were above the men of Middle-earth and could enslave them. It wasn't something that Sauron became, it was something that he hastened and exacerbated. That's not to say that Sauron didn't make them worse. He introduced them to Melkorism, literal devil worship, and with that, a temple to Melkor in their city. And even when Manwë smote the temple with lightning, the fact that Sauron was unharmed only strengthened the Dúnedain's faith in him. They were already rebellious and lost. Attacking the Undying Lands, or at least invading it and declaring it as their own, was sort of just the final straw. Even as Sauron, sitting in his seat in the temple, fell into the abyss opened by Ilúvatar's breaking of the world, he laughed. He knew that his enemy was defeated. He was pretty angry when he found that a good group of the faithful had already made their way to Middle-earth. And by the way, a lot of people who ask Númenor questions, they're really... a lot of those people read, the Silmarillion, and the second section of that is called, the second of three major sections, I would say, is called Akalabeth. I mean, it's really the fourth section, because there's Ainulindala, which is just really short, and Valaquenta, which is short, and then Quenta Silmarillion, which is quite lengthy, and then there's Akalabeth. And if I look at the table of contents here, Akalabeth starts at page 247, and then the next section of the Rings of Power and the Third Age starts at 273. So what we see here is that the Second Age section of the Silmarillion, the Akalabeth, which is all about Númenor, is less than 30 pages long. So it seems that there's not a whole lot of it. And yes, you go into the appendixes of The Lord of the Rings and some of the parts of Unfinished Tales tell you more about Númenor. But if you're really interested in a lot of Númenor stuff, I'm going to really just highly recommend you get this book. This is The Fall of Númenor, and this came out, just a few years ago. And this is, as you can see, this is quite the tome here. This has got a lot of book to it, And just and like I said, if you can get it in a beautiful hardcover like this, I highly recommend it. It's really great, and this has everything that Tolkien wrote about Númenor all in one handy place, and even told sequentially. It's not like a story so much; it's a chronicle. But it has everything, and really, really recommend it, because a lot of this stuff had been published in other places, but it was sort of like all over the maps, because you'd have to get the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, the appendices, the Lost Road and other writings, and other parts of the history of Middle-earth, so, and some of it was really obscure to get. So like I said, just highly recommend that. Let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes by the request of Matt Tyree, who asks, why does Gimli refer to it as Moria? He was excited to go there, yet he calls it by the derogatory Black Pit instead of its proper name, Khazad-dûm. Wouldn't that be like Myron calling himself Sauron or Melkor calling himself Morgoth? There's sort of three different reasons here. One is linguistic and the other two are literary. The linguistic reason is that Khazad-dûm is the dwarvish name, which is in their own language, which is called Khuzdul. The dwarves don't often share much of their languages, especially names, but a few words are known here and there. Gimli is a little freer with using Khuzdul around, we'll say, mixed company, especially as he gives the names in both Khuzdul and Sindarin for several mountains. Gimli is also a pretty smart character who knows that if he says Khazad-dûm, he will have to explain what it is to at least one or two of the people present, almost certainly to the hobbits. But if he says Moria, then, people are going to understand what he's talking about. The first of the literary reason is continuity. The word Moria first appeared in The Hobbit and was used as a battle cry by the dwarves, shouting out the name of their ancestral home. So Tolkien had laid the foundation already that dwarves are not at all insulted by the name Moria, and they use it freely. Of course, it didn't have the meaning Black Pit at that point in time when he was writing The Hobbit, but that's something that Tolkien came up with later. The last reason is really sort of a cluster of smaller things that we could talk about. Both names for the Lost Kingdoms are used by Gloin earlier in the story. He explains, our fathers called it Khazad-dûm, we call it Moria now. This tells us something important. It was called that at one point and is no longer called that. The dwarves have just become accustomed to calling it Moria. The next bit is that the first person to mention using it as a route to overcome the obstacle that is the Misty Mountains wasn't Gimli, it was Gandalf. He calls it Moria. It also actually says Moria on the doors of Durin. Moria is the elvish name, and it does mean Black Pit, but the elves were not being derogatory, they were teasing. It didn't become widely called that by dwarves until later, perhaps because they now felt it was a more apt name as it was fallen, and it was in darkness. But the fact that Celebrimbor was a great friend of the dwarves, and he didn't mean any disrespect, elves generally don't like living underground. They will if they have to. The elves in Mirkwood did, or the elves of Nargothrond, which is a dwelling that they essentially stole from dwarves, interestingly. But it is not their preference. Eregion was founded specifically to be a part of Gil-galad's realm that would be in friendship with the dwarves. So think of it less as a derogatory slur for their home and more like gentle teasing. It's likely that the dwarves had lots of funny words for elvish realms in their own language that would mean things like, tree bordello or whatever. That's the sort of humor that you sometimes see. I think that there's nothing wrong with Gimli calling it Moria. And by the way, I wouldn't say that he was excited to go there. He was interested to go there. Unless, of course, you're talking about the films, in which case he was very gung-ho and he was sure that his cousin Balin was still okay and that they were going to be, greeted with a feast. But in the book, it was Gandalf's idea to go, and Gimli was sort of like, I agree. I would like to find out what happened to my people. He hadn't heard from them in like 30 years, and he kind of figured that it might not have gone so well. He was hoping that they were alive, but I think Gimli, like I said, book Gimli is a lot smarter than movie Gimli. He's a very intelligent character. He certainly, was willing to go, and that was a huge bolster to Gandalf, who this was his idea, and it was an unpopular idea. Aragorn hated it, Boromir hated it, the hobbits hated it, Legolas hated it. So Gimli was like sort of the only guy in his corner at first. Anyway, that was the last question. I had a load of fun, and I'll remind you again at this point to help me out. If you haven't subscribed, please do so at this point in time. If you do subscribe, make sure you click the bell and turn on notifications and all that good stuff. And if you haven't hit the like button, I would ask that you hit the like button. Keep in mind, I stream most Thursday nights here on YouTube, doing things like the Council of Tolkien, or playing Tolkien-related video games, or reading Tolkien stuff to you guys and explaining all the lore and everything. We've been going through The Two Towers. That is the most recent book that we're trying to go through. And yeah, send me some questions. Consider membership. Membership really helps me out as well. It's very cheap. It's $5 a month. And really, you know, it helps me out a great deal. And you get to see all the videos nice and early. And your comments will all have this little badge on them and everything. And people will just say, hey, that person's a member. That's really cool. And your name is at the end of every video that you're a member during the period that I edit it. So there we go. We'll see you guys next time.